When we are evaluating an argument for a potential fallacy, so often what we're really doing is checking to see if the conclusion matches the reason. One of the ways the conclusion cannot match the reason is if the conclusion subtly changes topics from the premise. Such as in this case, we start off with evidence about the number of dependents being claimed on female tax returns, and then we make a conclusion about women buying motorcycles. Obviously, this argument is ridiculous and it's very easy to spot because motorcycles is very, very different than dependents. So you're not going to see an argument that has a flaw that's this obvious, but you could see something very, very similar. In this version, the evidence is about dependents being claimed on tax returns, and the conclusion is about women having more children. And there are actually two ways in which this argument subtly changes the language. First, the reason talks about dependents, and then the conclusion is about children. While it may be true that most dependents are children, not all dependents are children. College students and other adults who can't or are not working can be claimed as dependents in tax returns. The argument also makes a shift between the verbs. We start off with dependents being claimed on your tax returns, and then the conclusion is about having more children. Again, having children and claiming your children on your tax returns, those are two things that are often related, but they're not exactly the same thing. And it's those subtle differences that your exam will utilize to try and trip you up. Here's a question taken from an old exam. And to see the word shift, we're going to first simplify the argument. And we do that by asking, what's the conclusion and why do they think that? We have this great word therefore that lets us know the last sentence is the conclusion. So our conclusion is that the idea that teenagers eat more ice cream, well, that idea is false. And the reason they give is that when they track people 40 to 50 years old, those people are more likely to purchase ice cream. And they purchase it in larger amounts. And now that we've simplified the argument, it's a lot easier to see the shift. The conclusion is about eating ice cream, but the reason or evidence they give is about purchasing ice cream. And while purchasing and eating are often related, they're not exactly the same thing. So it's quite possible that when adults buy ice cream, they buy ice cream for teenagers who in turn eat the ice cream. Let's try one more. We start off by identifying our conclusion. We have a great word, clearly, that marks the opinion, and our conclusion is always an opinion. So our conclusion is that drivers with radar detectors are more likely to speed. And as I learned in the simplifying the argument lesson, when I simplify the argument, I want to make sure I pay attention to the quantifying adjectives, meaning those adjectives that tell me to what extent or how often. So in this case, the word regularly becomes a vital part of the conclusion. So now we ask, why do they think these drivers are more likely to speed regularly? In other words, what was their evidence? If we go up a few sentences, we see the evidence they're citing is vehicles being ticketed for exceeding the speed limit. So now we have our argument. Vehicles who were ticketed had radar detectors, therefore these vehicles and drivers are more likely to speed. The first and obvious shift or change in the conclusion is the introduction of this word regularly. And that's a problem because just because these vehicles got ticketed one time or on one particular weekend or over a month, that doesn't necessarily mean that that study or that time period was representative enough to use the word regularly. But there's another word shift that's a little bit more difficult and a lot more sinister. And the question I have to ask is this. If you get a ticket for speeding, does that mean you are speeding? I guess in an ideal world, yes. But that would be dependent on the assumption that the police officers were honest and the equipment they used to catch you was working properly. But in fact, if you get a speeding ticket, it doesn't mean that you're more likely to speed. In fact, if you go back in the history of the United States 50 or 60 years ago, there was actually a problem in the South with white police officers giving black drivers tickets almost randomly because they didn't want African Americans driving cars in their town. The point is, at least for our purposes, you need to make sure that the conclusion topic matches the reason topic exactly. And there is a difference between getting a speeding ticket and actually speeding. Here's one of my favorites. In this question, we have a series of rules about how customers of the Video King store can get a special discount coupon. And the rules are that if they've rented more than 10 videos, they can only get the coupon at the location from where they last rented a movie. But if they have not rented more than 10, then the only place they can get the coupon is at the Main Street location. And then we have Pat. Pat has not rented more than 10, but for some reason, Pat doesn't have to go to Main Street. Pat got her coupon at the Walnut Lane location. So now we have this discrepancy. We have all of our rules, but then they don't seem to apply to Pat. But now let's go back and take a look at the language in the argument. The passage talks about members, and members, and members, and members, and then Pat. But is Pat a member? You might think it sounds like she's a member because they're talking about members. And if you were talking to a person and this were part of the conversation, then you could probably logically assume that they were talking about Pat, who was also a member, because it was in the same paragraph or part of the conversation. But your exam is a whole lot meaner than a regular person, which means we have to get very literal on what the passage tells us. It may sound like Pat is a member, and the passage may imply that Pat is a member, but the passage doesn't explicitly say that Pat is a member. So, one of the reasons that Pat may not have to follow the rules is that Pat is a non-member, and non-members can still get the special discount coupon. I know it seems tricky and mean, but this is the personality of your exam. It's out to get you.